So let's check out whether you know how to use the poll system. We're going to do our first poll. And the first question we have is, we'd just like to know where you're joining us or what capacity you're joining us. I realize some of you will have a different, you may be both a parent and a teacher. Just pick the one that's closest, or the one that you sort of associate most with as you come into the session tonight. And if you're other, just because I see a lot of others coming up, if you wouldn't mind typing into the chat box what kind of other you are, like if you're a professor or something that doesn't fit necessarily into one of the categories. So, there we go. And now Megan's publishing the results. Look at that. It's just like magic. You can see it. So I am now going to stop talking, stop videoing, so I can have a sip of my pop. And I'm going to hand it over to Annie, who's going to introduce the Measuring What Matters project.
Welcome, everybody. This is our 4th webinar in a series of webinars, and it's been, the conversations have been really amazing, all part of this project that People for Education launched earlier this year. We've been working for years on public education issues, doing research, looking at what's going on in our schools, and over the course of the past few years, we've been really concerned about a kind of narrowing of the definition of education. We've been concerned that in our focus on getting scores up in reading, writing, and math, which are very important, it goes without saying, that we've lost sight a little bit of other important facets of education, and a lot of our policy and our funding and the kind of pressure for success is brought to bear on literacy and numeracy, but kind of squeezes out a lot of the other areas that we are sure are very important. We have done a lot of research. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, our research director, wrote a really amazing discussion paper that you can see online, and looked at what are the other important components of education, what kind of goals is it possible to set in these other areas, and is it possible to measure them? Because we know that what is measured matters, that it makes a difference in terms of the amount of time people are encouraged to spend on those things that are measured, to the recognition of their importance, and to an overall sense that these are part of the broad goals of education. So what we want to, what our goal in doing this project is, at the end of the project, we're going to be able to answer the question, are we providing students with the education they need for long-term success? And all of us will be able to be able to answer this question, is this school a good school in the broadest possible sense, or is this a good education system? So for now, we are suggesting that we should be looking at school success in areas like health, creativity, citizenship, social emotional skills, and the overall quality of the learning environment. We are working in two sort of streams at the same time. One, a technical part of the work where experts from across Canada, Rena being one of them, are looking at the various domains. They're figuring out what goes into that domain, what is it possible to, what kind of standards could we be setting, what is it possible to measure, and how could you measure success in that domain. Then we have a whole public piece in this webinar as part of that, where we're having amazing conversations with a very wide range of people about what do they think, what do they think that schools are for, do they think that it's about more than reading, writing, and math, do they think, for instance, when we talked about health, what goes into health? What does health mean? What are the components of health? Where does health fit in with the curriculum? And how can you measure it? When we talk about health, just as you'll hear when we talk about creativity, we mean it in the sort of largest possible sense. So based on the consultations which are happening with teachers, with students, with principals, with business leaders, with community organizations, based on a combination of all of those conversations that were happening and all that consultation and the ongoing work by the experts on the measurement and the kind of crossover as they talk to each other. By the end of this endeavor, we will have a set of goals for education and a way to measure our progress towards those goals that are useful inside schools. It's really important that we recognize these are all things already being done by teachers in our schools, and teachers measure and assess constantly. So it's a way of recognizing that and providing teachers and schools with something that's useful to them, but also that's publicly understandable, so that the public on the outside is not faced just with that kind of simplistic graph that we always see, you know, how our score is up, then we must be doing well, that they'll have a real sense of how we're doing in our education system. I get to run a poll now, and the first quick question is about creativity, and we want to know from you, this is part of our research, do you think developing students' creativity is an appropriate goal for schools, or do you agree with with this statement, developing students' creativity is an appropriate goal for schools? So remember, you just click on the little letter that's alongside of where there's a happy face and then some hands. A, strongly agree, B, somewhat agree, C, somewhat disagree, D, strongly disagree. So we want to know what you think of that poll. When everybody has voted in the poll, then the fabulous technologically adept Megan will post the results. Okay, nearly everybody strongly agrees. So that's our first question. Second, if a school has good EQAO scores, we can assume they're doing a good job overall, including developing students' creativity. So we look at, this is what we have now, is we have our scores in our standardized tests, for those of you from Massachusetts, in reading and writing and math. If a school has good scores in those areas, can we assume that they're doing a good job overall? Do you strongly agree? B, somewhat agree, C, somewhat disagree, D, strongly disagree. Okay, so people somewhat disagree or strongly disagree, evenly split. But nobody thinks that we can assume that schools are doing a good job overall just by looking at their scores in literacy and numeracy. So now my great job is to introduce Rena. I'm not going to read her bio to you. I'm just going to tell you that it's incredibly exciting to have Rena on board for this, especially because she comes at the idea of creativity from a very, very broad perspective. So Rena knows a lot and cares a lot about the arts. She's a musician, she's a visual artist, but she's also a carpenter, and she also has a diploma in architecture. So she looks at creativity from an environmental sense and from an innovation sense. And she's also been very exciting to talk to when we've talked to her about this project. So she's already brought to it a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of new and really interesting ideas. And a few weeks ago, we had a meeting online of the domain leads, as they're called. Rena about creativity, Bruce Ferguson on health, Stuart Shanker on social emotional skills, and the person whose name I've forgotten about citizenship. Somebody help me there. Anyway, you can't just yell at me. Alan Sears, thank you. And what was wonderful in this conversation was hearing everybody's excitement about what they were thinking about in their domains, and also how much the domains crossed over. So from Rena, we've already learned so much about why creativity is connected to citizenship, is connected to social emotional skills, is connected to health, and overall learning environments. So Rena, I put it over to you.
Okay, so we have 20 people plus me, and it's been quite fun listening to what people have to say as we've been coming up to this moment. I think, Kelly, your son's name is the same as my son's name. I have a Hayden, and I did most of my graduate work in Massachusetts, so whoever is out there, I've been imagining Boston while we've been talking, so it's a delight to join all of you. I have 5 slides, and I'm going to spend about 2 minutes on each one. The first one is what is creativity? It seems to me that it might not be a bad idea to define what we mean by that. And there are surprisingly few definitions of creativity. I was afraid that once I started looking, there would be zillions, because there is this idea that creative people just go on and on and on and on and define and make up things. In fact, there's a lot of agreement that creativity is not only about the production of something novel or original, but also about something useful. And I'm going to come back all the way through this 10-minute or 15-minute presentation that I do to talk about these two complementary things. Novelty is important, yes, but if the idea doesn't have some utility, then many of us would agree that it's actually not a fully creative act. So creativity is about producing things and ideas, but it's also in schooling a way to learn, a way to solve problems, and a way to express what you're thinking and feeling beyond words alone. I would argue that creative acts are fulfilling in and of themselves. There's joy in creative production. I would also argue that creativity is not subject specific, and Annie already alluded to that in the introduction when she talked about my background in the arts, but also that I don't see creativity being limited to the arts alone. And finally, I'm going to stress that creativity is not just about what you produce, but about the process of how you produce it. So in the remaining 4 slides, when I say creativity, I'm meaning all these things. Okay, now I'm going to press my own button. Watch this. Bingo. Second slide. Why does creativity matter over the lifespan? Creativity enhances quality of life not only in schooling but beyond. And I think one of the things that students learn if they're enabled to take part in creative acts during school is that they learn to prosper not only intellectually but also socially, emotionally, physically, and I would say even spiritually. And creativity has the promise of promoting equity. I won't say that it always does, but there's great promise in reducing some of the gaps that we sometimes see between high and low achieving students, and especially students who come from lower socioeconomic groups. Some of the studies that I'll talk about in a paper that I'm preparing right now show how those students who are engaged deeply in the arts, the ones who benefit most are in fact the ones in the lower socioeconomic groups. It's also the case that creativity is a hallmark of community strength as measured by economy, health, and wellness, and I think that's an incredibly important piece over the lifespan. But perhaps most important of all, I think innovation is what we need to address some of the problems that we face in a global way, and I'm thinking here of things like climate change. And creativity is one of the things that's going to drive that innovation. So, now we've defined it and we've said what it might look like at school and beyond. The third task that I've been given is to talk about how it is that we can describe creativity in ways that can be assessed or even measured, although I hesitate to use the M word. What I'm going to say is that creativity, I think, manifests in many contexts. So when I said it's not subject specific, it's not context specific either. Sure, we see it in the arts, but we also see it in entrepreneurship. We see it in sport. I don't know a lot about hockey, but I'm told that Wayne Gretzky was a very creative hockey player, and I've read about how creative he was. So somebody's making dinging sounds. Okay, I won't talk about hockey.
That means
anyway,
Annie has a question.
Oh, okay. Does that mean you?
No, I was clapping. I wasn't asking a question. I was saying, yes, great, Wayne Gretzky.
She hit the wrong button.
Okay, so but that's a good example, right? Because people don't think about creativity in sport. And also, of course, in languages and science and mathematics. And so it's not just the creativity, but it's the components, the competencies, the dispositions to make us so that we can see in a number of contexts. And then most important of all, we can cultivate. So students can learn to do the kinds of things that lead to creative acts. They can learn to experiment, to value risk-taking, to value originality, to become more perceptive, to think flexibly, lots of others. There's 20, 50, 60 dispositions, but the point is that these can be cultivated. And as I said earlier, this notion of novelty and usefulness, I'm going to suggest that being creative without some sort of critical component to evaluate what you're creating means that we're looking at an incomplete act. Next slide, Rena. Push the button. Good girl. Okay, so how do we foster it? This is the fun part. It's also the tricky part. So I'm going to just go way out there, and I'm going to say that, of course, creativity should be part of daily school life. Obviously, we can do it through the fine and performing arts. We can also do it through what I think of as the domestic arts, like cooking and sewing, and through the outdoor arts, like canoeing and hiking. We sometimes forget that those acts are also artistic acts. So beyond the arts, we can also cultivate creative approaches in all other subjects. And at this point, because I'm not behind, I'm going to tell a lovely anecdote about the hiring of a person that we think of as being creative, namely Da Vinci. And when Da Vinci was hired, he offered services as a musician, engineer, painter, sculptor, I can't remember what else. And the position he was seeking was as a painter in Milan. And he was hired. And the people who hired him said, "You are quite free to pursue your science as long as it doesn't interrupt your time for painting." And I find that a very interesting juxtaposition, because I think 500 years later we might say, you are quite free to do your art as long as it doesn't interrupt your science. And both of those are bizarre restrictions, because creativity is not subject specific, and one form of creative impulse feeds the other. So I can well imagine how we could bring that kind of approach to science and mathematics. The third subpoint on this slide is about student-driven projects. And I've put in brackets the 20% approach. This refers to the Google 20% project, where one day a week people are free to pursue what interests them most. There are high schools all through North America in small numbers who've adopted this approach to see what happens if you put that kind of power and ownership into the lives of students. So I'm going to suggest that a completely different way of looking at curriculum and putting subjects in boxes might also be a way of making creativity part of school life. It should be part of extracurricular life, and I won't go into detail now because I'm hoping we will in the conversation. But there are many ways of bringing schools and communities together to foster creative acts and critical thinking. Architects' offices, community theater, neighborhood gardens are 3 examples. And last but not least, how do we measure or assess creativity? How do we know it's happening? And the challenge here is to assess creativity without reducing it into some sort of measure that is the antithesis of a creative act. So in keeping with the suggestions that I've made about how we might introduce creativity into schooling, that would also mean that the ways that we assess students would not involve sitting down to a different kind of EQAO test that said at the beginning, this is your test on creativity. It might involve developing exemplars of creative student work. It might involve student documentation through various ways of showing what it is they've learned and the impact that it's had. I'm almost less interested in assessing students than I am interested in assessing schools and communities. And I'm hoping that whoever is here from Massachusetts knows something about the index that Massachusetts, and I think California and Oklahoma are also developing sister tools, where what we're looking at is an inventory of the kinds of opportunities that are available both in and outside school that might enhance creativity. So a school that is creativity rich might also be a school that has lots of arts courses, has school community partnerships at local businesses and in community gardens, and perhaps has clubs that allow students to engage in creative acts. So what we're looking at there as the unit of analysis is not the student, not the teacher, but the school and the community themselves. I'm seeing lots of comments and I can't read and talk at the same time. So I think that's where I'll stop in terms of introducing some ideas. And I recognize that some of these ideas are unlike schooling in some ways, but I think that's probably provocative in terms of the conversation that we're hopefully going to have. So I'm now not talking.
You'll have plenty of time to talk. And look, Charles Ungerleider already has a question, so go ahead, Charles.
Rena, I'm wondering about the relationship between what you've said and...
Sorry, Charles, can you just make sure your microphone's close to your mouth?
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Rena, I wonder if you could comment on the relationship between what you said and students with special needs. Where does that intersection occur?
I'm not going to generalize about students with special needs. It's a massive population and there are, all kinds of different needs that are special. But I will say that there is a fair amount of literature that suggests that students who are challenged in particular ways may in fact thrive at school when they have the opportunity to pursue projects that are of interest to them, when they have the opportunity to be guided in artistic ventures. And particularly, I think we see this with at-risk students who are behaviorally at risk, especially in sort of grade 7, 8, 9. There's a fair bit of literature that says there are ways to engage those students through the arts in particular, through drama, for example, that will not only enliven their time at school, but there are also indicators that that will keep them in school long enough to get interested in other subjects and graduate.
Rena, I'm going to ask you a question now, and then we're going to open it up to everybody. We've been having some conversations with Sheldon Levy at Ryerson, and also with people, and there are people in there now at the Rotman School, and about different ways of thinking of creativity. And I'm thinking in particular of Ryerson right now, where they have something called the Digital Media Zone, where there are young entrepreneurs starting amazing businesses, mostly to do with, as it says, working in the digital land. Can you talk a little bit about somebody's just asking in this chat, can creativity be taught? Can you talk a tiny bit more about that idea of creativity and innovation and where it connects with either the idea of business or that kind of problem-solving idea?
Okay, I heard 3 questions there, so I'm going to try and do them one at a time. Can creativity be taught? Oh man, I've lost the second and third question. All right, let me start with just the first question. Can creativity be taught? This is Twyla, I think, who asked that question. Sure, yes, we can teach and we can create conditions where creativity can be fostered. We can teach math, we can teach kids to play the piano. Some children will learn more or more quickly or more deeply than others, and I think that's true with any endeavor that where it's possible for somebody to support another learner. Creativity is something that is like any other endeavor. But the way that people respond to that is going to vary, and we're going to have a lot of kids who are going to become more creative in their actions, but aren't going to do that, so-called genius breakthrough thing. And there's some people who speak about different kinds of creativity, and this sounds a bit hokey, but it's actually a useful distinction. Some people talk about big C creativity and little c creativity and mini c creativity, where the big C creativity are innovations, ideas, artifacts that are seminal to the field, so that a huge thing, you know, the proof that there's gravity or something becomes really important in physics. That's a big idea and what we don't exactly expect to foster at school. Then there's the, or not in the short term, then there's the little c creativity where there may be an original act or idea that's useful in a context. A community garden may find a way to mulch their plants so that they don't have to be so dependent on rainfall. And that has application, and it's a new idea, and you know, that would be something we might call little c. That's the level that I think we're most likely to see things happening at schools, where people can say, wow, there was a problem, I solved it, I have this great idea, and maybe there's another community that can benefit from it. Then the mini C creativity is basically just on a personal level, more engaged ways of you know, being alive. And I won't go into that one because I don't think it's as interesting in this context. So,
I like the
oops, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Abby. I do remember
interrupting you. No, I like the idea of just engage with being alive. Can I bring in Josie for a second, if you're willing, Josie? Because I think that there's a good example there of your sort of middle C creativity in the creativity work that they've done at Rotman. And maybe you can describe that for people, and then we can ask everybody what creativity means to them. Can you have a microphone that works, Josie?
Hi, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yep. So yeah, so at Rotman, the approach that we've been really thinking about creativity is actually taking a design approach and thinking about how do you engage with the world in a different way so that you can create lots of different possibilities of exploring how to solve different problems and how to, as you said, look into the world and see an opportunity for yourself. So it's about teaching actual skills such as how do you develop for empathy for the world around you. How do you approach a problem where you are willing to explore different possibilities, not be afraid of failure, and willingness to try lots of different ideas to explore what might be possible. And then really thinking about what kind of a system could you create around it, because what we've seen is that it's about creating opportunities to express in different ways so that students can see that they have an ability to have a voice for their ideas.
I completely agree, and I think what you're talking about there is what I am also referring to in setting a context for creative dispositions, and habits can thrive. So things like developing empathy that you spoke about, and willingness to take risks are among those habits.
So I think that everybody has, and Rena, you obviously have described creativity in a very big way. And if we think of the world right now, we definitely, and I liked your point about how that it's incredibly important for kind of solving global problems. So there is amazing chat going on about creativity. People concerned that for some students being creative is actually difficult, that it's hard for them to take risks. Some of them want things to be more straightforward, and that sort of abstract idea of creativity can be difficult, and some are worried about the assessing part. So do people, when we think of the word, when you think of the word creativity, what does it mean to you? I'm reading the chat here, and I know that you all don't have microphones, so Margaret talks about her son getting the opportunity to present research in a creative way in the form of documentaries, animations, interviews. What are some other things what does creativity mean to you when you think about that, or when you think about what's going on in school? Anybody?
Like Hayden's program that Summer was talking about, where the kids get to do passion projects and take the lead on that.
I'm going to jump in, and I've just read the chat because I was chatting. This passion project thing, I really love, and that's the one that's based on the 20% notion. I've done that with undergraduate and graduate students at university, and they have produced the best work I've ever seen when I do it. It is frightening though, because what I do is say your mark, or your work for this course, so imagine I'm teaching a math course, is to learn something new, learn something you've never done before, something you'd love to do, peel away all the excuses, I don't have time, I'm never going to get around to it, just learn something new, anything, I don't care what it is, and then at the end of the course tell me how it's related to mathematics. And just so you're not afraid, everybody gets an A. So I take away the educational currency of the mark, because that's my currency, right? I give it out or take it away or whatever. And then run it very much like those passion projects. And so at first, people's response, and I think this happens at the high school level as well, is, you've got to be kidding me. Like, she's not really serious. And then it's, well, I want to learn how to knit, but there's no math in that. Or, whatever it is they decide to do. And the outcome of these projects is staggering. So I've seen it not only at the levels that we're describing here, but right through university. And so, you have to set up the conditions very carefully, but boy, the outcomes can be astonishing and life-giving.
So in the chat, people are, somebody at Summer wants to talk. I think Hayden's going to talk, but people are saying creativity is the power to see possibilities, the ability to look at things differently. Somebody's agreeing with the slide that said it's the power to connect the seemingly unconnected. And Summer, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, Hayden just wanted to talk a little bit about the passion projects that he does.
Go ahead, Hayden.
So basically what we do in passion projects is, so our teacher lets us choose something that we're passionate about, and then after in the lab in the computer lab we go on the computer and we write down some information, put some pictures, all that stuff, and then after a few weeks, months, our teacher lets us show it to the class, and basically teaches each other what we're passionate about, and and right now we're doing one on energy. Well, the grade 5s are doing energy, and the grade 4s are doing rocks and minerals. And I believe next week, or the end of this week, we're presenting them.
And I should say, it's been amazing the subjects that Hayden has chosen to do. I wrote in the chat, but he did a project on the first film, and it was amazing to see him come alive. That would be something that probably wouldn't be included in the curriculum at a grade 5 level, but he absolutely loved it.
That's great, Hayden. Thank you so much for sharing.
So people in the chat are talking about intellectual freedom. So the idea of expressing one's ideas in any medium, and I think you talked about that too, Rena. So it's the idea of getting creativity in a way, oddly enough, out of the box that sometimes we keep it in, so that we understand these, big solutions and big ideas. And it was great that you started with, Leonardo da Vinci, and you think of, not just painting, but, flying, things like that, the idea of gravity, that kind of creativity of looking at something and going, I bet I can imagine another way of doing this, is something that can drive kids. And if you're you know, one of our issues has been that if you define education as success in a few subjects that you can measure quite narrowly, maybe we miss the boat for these big projects or the things like what Hayden has been describing. So does everybody feel that everybody has their own sense of what creativity means to them? And if so, I think that we can move on to then the harder question, which gets at what we're trying to do here. Jackie made the most fantastic slides, I have to say, for this webinar. The pictures are very nice.
I was being creative.
Good for you, Jackie. So when we've been talking about these various domains, there are various places where the rubber starts to hit the road, and where our goal of developing goals and measures for success come into life. So when you think of creativity, a lot of you described what you thought, what creativity meant to you, what it felt like maybe, the ability, Josie's talked about the ability for students to be able to develop their own voice, to do things in the areas we're passionate about, to be able to express yourself. So if you were looking at a school, and you were trying to decide whether or not this was a school that was effectively developing creativity, what would you take as evidence of that? Either from what the students were doing or were able to do or were being supported to do, or what was happening in the school? What would be some examples of concrete evidence that a school was effectively developing creativity?
And Kelly just posted that one of the comments we heard from a bunch of educators in the schools we were working with this week in the near north is that it would be much easier to really do the work of fostering creativity if the curriculum could be decluttered or streamlined. And I think I've heard that a lot from teachers too. They find it's just so overwhelming. Really interesting point.
Oops, then I swore when it wasn't on, lucky for you. Twyla said flexible seating arrangements in classrooms, summer, portfolios that compile what students have accomplished. Margaret, being able to provide, oh now everybody's just having ideas so quickly I can't even read them. 3, completely different answers to one question. That's a great thing. What an the way we think of measuring right now. It's like there's only one right answer. That's very creative. Having art projects that don't all look the same. Every student drawing the same dog is not creative. Producing unique projects. So Kelly is saying that a lot of the feedback that we've heard already actually has to do with reducing the barriers to creativity. So not necessarily about trying to foster more creativity, but trying to get out of the way of creativity. So more risk taking. Somebody pushed enter before they were finished, I think. And Rena says various ways to demonstrate knowing. So you walk into a school and kids are doing TED Talks, they have portfolios, they have installations, they're designing business plans. Judy wants us to celebrate mistakes, and I think that's where the innovation guys and the entrepreneurship guys, we went to a whole meeting of people talking about entrepreneurship and innovation, and it actually came down to, it's not that we have to teach, kids to start companies, but we more have to get them in the right mindset, and that mindset had to do with a lot of social emotional skills, but it had a lot to do with supporting creativity, and in particular being willing to take risks, which means you make mistakes, you fail, you try again. So Twyla is saying it seems so basic, but if the environment's not conducive to free movement and sharing, creativity cannot be fostered. So this is one of the places where things cross over, because we were talking about citizenship the other day. We were also talking about the sharing of ideas, the exchange of knowledge, and when we're talking about quality learning environments, we're talking about what it actually feels in, how it feels in the building that you're learning in. So the free movement, in a way, physically, is there free movement? Is there a sense of being in a place where it's easy to express yourself? Summer talks about trusting students to have input, so that again goes to the citizenship piece and the quality learning environments. where each answer is different and each student is proud of their achievement. So I love these things about all the answers being different because then when we think about how we're seeing evidence of the fact that it's supported for all the answers to be different, then, and how do you measure that exactly? People saying they like the idea of the portfolio with a variety of responses. Yeah, so Twyla, are you a teacher? Because Twyla says she likes to look at curriculum expectations as suggestions. She prefers to focus on the big ideas or overall expectations. And I think a lot of teachers work that way now. And part of what we're trying to do is recognize what teachers are already doing, not impose some new thing on it. So it is partly the mindset. I think the mindset piece is really, really interesting. Rena, do you have any thoughts about this idea of a creative mindset and how we support a creative mindset in a classroom?
I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think it's similar to what Josie was talking about the dispositions that you have approaching something. So being able to look at something in more than one way, and I think that's what that lovely example that somebody gave about 3 right answers to the same problem. That would be something that would be part of a creative mindset, empathy for others' ideas, the ability to revisit something that you thought you knew or an answer that you thought you had and maybe change your mind yourself. Recognizing that just because somebody doesn't share the view that you do doesn't mean that their view is wrong and yours is right. I mean, it sounds incredibly fundamental, but it's not. This is, well, it is, but it's not always there.
Josie, you have a question?
I was just going to comment a little bit about the mindset piece because I think that for I think and for Rotman, the way we think about creativity is that yes, you can build skills in the classroom that are concrete ways of going through a problem and going through a project, but it's also the way that a teacher approaches sharing something in the classroom, and the idea that there is an openness and a willingness to take risks and be wrong, and that looks a lot different than necessarily curriculum expectations. And some of the most exciting work that I've been seeing with teachers are their willingness to be open and free to try something that might look a little bit different in the classroom, so that the students actually have space to play and space to try something that they might not otherwise try. Because in order for I think in order for Hayden to have been so adventurous in his projects, the teacher would have had worked very hard to set up the conditions. And what is the mindset of a teacher going into something like that?
So that, again, Josie, points to the interconnectedness of it all. We were just in a session, Jackie and I, yesterday with a group called Success Beyond Limits, a school in the northeast part of Toronto. And they talked a lot. We were talking about what makes a quality learning environment. They were talking about respect, for instance. So for a teacher to be brave enough to respect the students enough to be able to be open to all sorts of ways of thinking and risk taking. And Kelly's just brought up an interesting point too, back to the interconnection, which is that that there's a strong connection between creativity and social emotional skill development, because sometimes, if you're defining creativity as taking a risk, it's much easier if you feel self-confident. And then what the people in the entrepreneurship innovation world talk about being able to take a risk, see that something isn't working, and then pivot and move on to the next thing, even if you can't imagine it yet. That if you don't have the social emotional skills that allow you to understand that you can learn things, where you've learned to be persistent and struggle and make it through problems, then it's harder to do that. I think it's also interesting, Rena, you were talking about empathy, and when those entrepreneurs were talking about empathy, they thought empathy was an incredibly important competency to have, because they wanted to be successful business people, and for them, empathy for the customer, by which they meant being able to actually understand, as opposed to thinking, I've got a great idea and I'm going to sell it to you, being able to understand what people need, what kind of problems people are facing, and trying to come up with solutions for them as opposed to the other way around. So does anybody, I still think that we're, yeah, so Judy says figuring out what creativity looks like in all disciplines. So one of the things that the domain leads are going to be doing is looking at all of the curriculum in Ontario, not just curriculum in a subject, and thinking about where this domain flows through all of the curriculum. So some are saying people should be able to participate in things in different grades. Creative projects are not graded, as in Rena's example, as evaluation kills it. But are there other ways to evaluate creative projects then if there's a feeling that that evaluation can kill creativity? I would expect it. So a range of co-curricular activities, and I think it's really interesting. Everybody's recognizing, you know, robotics and tech clubs. And Chris is summarizing the creativity skills that Josie talked about: empathy, problem solving, risk taking, and then measuring the success at achieving these. So that's one way of looking at the evidence and being able to say, so how are we supporting these various factors in their classes or in the school?
Annie, I just want to jump in about that comment about evaluation and grading. I see those as very different things. So the grading part is the number that you get at the end: 95, A+, 4, level 3 minus, or whatever. For me, that's a very different thing from evaluating something. So I don't see when I say that I support the students in that sort of personal project, and I like Hayden's term, the passion project, there's a lot of evaluation, there's a lot of critique, there's a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of peer support and evaluation, there's constant assessment of how something is evolving and whether it's working or not. It's a bit like, you know, imagine a crit in an art class where everybody walks around the room and, you know, can be pretty strong in their critiques. So I don't imagine a creative process not being evaluated. What I was suggesting is that we don't hang this grade at the end of it, like you get a 90 and this other kid gets 65.
No, I think it's an important kind of clarification. So Dan, who doesn't want to sing, are you still there? And do you know anything about the Massachusetts Creativity Index? And can you type in the chat about it if you're not sure if your microphone works? I think you're still there.
Works. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion, and there's a lot that I feel I could add, but glancing down at my clock, we're close to 8 o'clock, and I feel I have more to say than I can say in 60 seconds. The first step I would say is that this has been a very effective group at determining the skills and competencies that take place in creativity. And it's one of the challenges that we face as educators and people who support this issue, is how do we discuss this outside of our own realms? Because at the core of this, what happens in the school is a political issue. It has to do with the Ministry of Education, it has to do with members of Parliament, it has to do with elected officials and superintendents. So the question that I would add to this is, what kind of public policy can be instituted that would create the changes that people are so ably suggesting in this webinar? And that is how I came up with what was then called the Massachusetts Creative Challenge Index, but also the Oklahoma Innovation Index. And just very quickly, I hope to whet your appetite, because I would love to see an initiative in Ontario, or anywhere in Canada for that matter. First off, I question the value of trying to measure the increase or decrease in individual creative capacity. If you look at how we measure public health, in the United States, we have the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They do measurements of public health for expectant mothers, for newly born, for youth at risk. And what they do is they don't have a definition of public health. For example, everybody has a temperature of 98.6. What they do is they measure behaviors and activities. And from that, they get a snapshot of public health. That's the model that we're using in Massachusetts and in Oklahoma. Again, all of you do an excellent job of identifying the skills and competencies required for creativity. And I also would add to that that creativity is not a gift. It's a practice. The gift is the passion to keep doing the work. But the creativity itself is a practice. The more you do it, the more adept you are. So if you agree with that assessment, then why can't we set up a quantifiable index that asks how many opportunities are there for students to engage in creative work, to continue that practice? And so what Oklahoma has done is they've reduced it to 8 actions, verbs, or skills that you can measure. And it has to do with what happens in the classroom. It doesn't have to do with measuring standardized test scores at the state capitol or the provincial capital. It has to do with what's going on in the classroom. And ultimately, that's the goal of any index. That's the goal of any assessment, is to change what happens in the classroom, to allow students to engage in creative practice. My clock says it's 8:02, so...
it's okay, Dan. We're going to 8:30.
What's that?
It's okay. This goes to 8:30.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I was thinking about my dinner time. Sorry.
We do have a couple more slides to cover, but...
Well, I think that, I mean, I could talk quite a bit longer about this, about how the issue works politically and what it takes to change in the schools. But I would suggest, again, is that as you look at your communities, not only ask what would be ideal in our schools, but ask how do we get there politically? And I think we have a tremendous opportunity in North America because of the economic imperative for innovation. I think that we should be looking at these policies and working together with legislators and MPs to try to get it instituted.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I think that, yes, we will post links to the websites of the Massachusetts Creativity. And it's so great to have you here talking about it. And we at People for Education absolutely believe that the point of all this is to change policy, and it is partly about, it is partly political, small p political. We are a nonpartisan group, but we definitely believe also that policy changes by work from the outside, by work from a wide range of people getting interested in talking about wanting something different. And I think the point that you bring up is very important, that it's not necessarily, and what this project is not necessarily about, is thinking about new ways to assess individual students. It's definitely not about that, but it's more thinking about how can we assess, how can we recognize important things that are going on in schools, and set goals for those important things, and then assess how we're doing in terms of making progress towards those goals. And I think that what you talk about is about figuring out the opportunities rather than a new test for students. And I love your thing about the public health, where they're not measuring, deciding if everybody is at 98.6 or whatever you're supposed to be at, then we are successful, but more looking at the behavior. So I think we have a lot to learn from Massachusetts. Somehow we seem to have gotten into having chickens at school, which many times our conversations have somehow led to talking about that. Now we're going to ask you guys again another couple of questions. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about what Dan was talking about? And has it sparked any more ideas about, I'm just going to go back for a second, about what evidence would be, if you thought of it as the way Dan described it, which is the evidence would be of the opportunities or the activities in school. Were there other things that came to mind in terms of what we would assess? So somebody asks Dan, if wouldn't you say that one of the more important things that happens to support learning, that assessment is one of the things that happens to support learning. But assessment can happen at various, in the class and the outside. I think that there's a lot of people just wanting more references to it. And a part of what we have a Measuring What Matters website, and part of what we'll be collecting there is various work. So the work going on that Rena's doing at Queen's, the work they're doing at Rotman and at Ryerson, the Massachusetts Index, so that we can all keep building on these ideas. So, the poll. We've talked a lot about creativity. What do you think now? Should we set goals for schools in the area of creativity? And should we find ways to measure progress towards those goals? So the question is, should we set goals in the area of creativity, and should we find ways to measure progress? A, no goals or measures for creativity are needed in our schools. Or B, we should set explicit goals but not measure progress. Or C, we should set explicit goals and measure progress. So go ahead and vote. It's the little letter just below your name is where you vote. So people, for the most part, are saying, yes, we should set goals and we should measure progress. But I think it's very interesting, the discussion that's going on in the chat about what that measuring is. So we will definitely keep in mind, and have been keeping in mind as we've been talking to people all over the province. Twyla asked, does measure equal grade? And no, I don't think it does from our perspective, but we have to make sure that we're clear when we talk about measurement what we mean. And Chris says there isn't any point in setting goals if you're not going to measure your progress. And I think that measurement has gotten a bad name lately, but it is really important. And Kelly's saying, Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, it's critical creativity not be relegated to extracurricular, just to extracurricular activities. Okay, next poll question. Oh, is there a next poll question? No. Okay, now you guys are going to talk again. So we have also had lots of conversations all around the province about the pros and cons of setting goals for our schools and finding ways to measure progress. And it's important that in this project that we have launched, that we're definitely wanting to wrestle with the hard stuff. There's lots of things we don't have answers for, and there's lots of problems when you get into the area of measuring. There's lots of things that become controversial or things people don't agree on, and it's really important that we address them, that we not go, no, we've got a perfect idea here, let's not talk about any of the hard stuff. So when you think about the hard stuff or the good stuff, when Chris says, there's no point in setting goals if you're not going to measure, that's one example of the kind of pro. But so what are the pros and cons of setting goals in the area of creativity, and especially in terms of what are the pros and cons in terms of finding ways to measure our progress towards meeting those goals? So Anita says measuring means constantly reviewing and seeking feedback. And yes, Chris, this is goals for schools. So a goal, but how do you get at a goal for school? So back to what Dan said, is it because you observe various things in classrooms? Do you have to start with individual students and kind of roll it up to the school level? I don't know the answer to that question. But yes, and Kelly, you can jump in if I'm saying this in the wrong way, but our understanding is that these are goals for schools rather than going right back down and having individual specific assessments for individual students.
This is Kelly, and I think that our focus is on a measure of school success. Some of the things, particularly in areas beyond creativity, that people suggest sometimes involve collecting data from students, not necessarily assigning a value to the data that comes from students. So it might be about individual students. We talked in the health webinar about assessing students' fitness levels as an indicator that a school is a healthy school. So it can relate to what students are are able to do, but the thought is that the focus of this process should be on a goal for schools.
Thanks, Kelly. And Sue says, I'm in the con department and I do measurement for a living. So, Sue, Chris asked you why con. And Sue answers that it seems organic to not measure, rather create a cadre of champions or given the freedom to try stuff. Can you say more about that, Sue? I think that part of our goal is to change the public's mind and also to change policy so that it's, you know, that room for creativity is more supported. When you talk about that being a con, do you think that there are other ways then to, or do you think that actually the measuring would decrease the possibility of there being champions who are with the freedom to try stuff? And Twyla says it sends a message to community that creativity matters. It matters enough to measure, and I think that that's the assumption that we're making about all of the measurement. And I think so Sue says policy seems like something the ministry says must happen, and that is an issue for sure. So what we're trying to do is ensure that we're working with lots and lots and lots of teachers so that this isn't just something the ministry says must happen, it's actually something the general public says must happen, that it's important, and it's so important we're going to measure it. Dan, you want to talk?
I just want to raise a point about the question of policy and why it's so important, whether it's issued by the ministry or other sources. How do we set our priorities in a democratic society, small d? The only way we do that is through the parliamentary and legislative process. So if we want creativity to be a priority of our schools, then because the schools are funded and policies are established for the schools, then we necessarily need to go through the political process. And I think the key to this, which I think Annie just related to, is we need to convince the broader community to change the expectations of those people of what should happen in the schools. Right now, since we do standardized testing, then obviously the priority is mastering content, not on creativity or process. So if we can change that policy, then all of these wonderful ideas that people have been advancing are more likely to happen in the schools.
Thank you very much, Dan. And that is the sort of one of the kind of fundamental beliefs of People for Education, that is that it's about sort of changing the public mind, and that is what changes policy. Now, Julie's asked an interesting question, saying, couldn't the goal be that creativity happen without dictating how it should happen? And so, if you're setting goals and measuring progress, is it necessary to dictate how it happens, or is it enough then to just be measuring with the opportunities and the activities? Dan, again. Go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, I threatened to be verbose, I guess. If you look at how Oklahoma has designed its innovation index, which has not been made public yet, but they have reduced their index to about a page and a half, basically 8 questions related to 8 creative skills and actions. But one of the things they've been very clear about is not proscribing or prescribing what happens in the classroom, but offering suggestions. So for example, if one of the competencies is generating ideas, fluency in ideas, then in the index it offers suggestions of activities that promote that skill. So the teacher then looks at her or his lesson plan and decides, what do I do that promotes that specific skill? Clearly, some of the things that will be necessary will be additional professional development. Because at least in the United States, you have a whole generation of teachers who've known nothing but NCLB. But I think that it's not a case of saying you can only do this in the classroom, but rather it is a way to liberate teachers to do what they're best able to do, which is to be creative in the challenge of teaching.
No, I think it's so exciting for us that there are lots of examples out there, and that this is, it's not some harebrained scheme that's actually possible. Summer has asked if will the ministry buy in or just think that this is another cost that shouldn't be carried by the ministry. Well, in fact, we've gone to the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Children and Youth Services. They have provided some funding for this whole project. And the ministry is interesting. They're happy right now to talk about, well, we're in the middle of an election, so who knows, but right now the current government is happy to talk about expanding the definition of success in education, and they certainly talk about creativity. I think they know, too, that just imposing something new from the top down isn't going to work, and that they were happy to have an independent organization that's able to bring together disparate groups, including teachers and policymakers and students and anybody who wants to talk about this, to pull these ideas together. So I think that, yes, ministries will buy in. I think there's broad recognition of how vital these skills are to success in success, happiness, engagement in all sorts of areas. So Margaret has suggested another form of measurement, which is having a rating system like Echo Schools, where you can be an Echo School at various levels, silver, gold, platinum. So she suggested measuring how many of the identified creative opportunities, behaviors, activities are offered at the school, so that you would have levels like gold, silver, or platinum. So a question that comes up from having levels like that, people have brought up a concern, and one of the cons people have brought up is that once you start rating schools, and rating that R word leads to the next R word, which is ranking the schools. So people have said, are we going to end up in the situation just like we have now with the literacy and numeracy scores, where we'll end up with a ranking, but you get ranked on creativity too? So do people see that as a problem, and do you see ways around that problem? Oh, and also Summer says, how do we get employers to value creativity? I think one of the things that's really interesting is we've been talking, we went to see the Council of Chief Executive Officers of Canada. Creativity is valued by employers. There's been a lot of work done by the Conference Board of Canada, the Chief Executive Officers, Chambers of Commerce. So when employers talk about what the skills and competencies they want to see in their employees, creativity is definitely among them, and that's where creativity crosses all these lines. And Chris says he thinks employers naturally value creativity. So Summer, it's a great discussion. She says they say they value it, but they aren't willing to pay for it or provide training to promote it. Now, this goes back to Dan's point that part of what there has been, somebody said in some other webinar I've been in the last 20 or 30 years, we've been very, very successful at convincing the public that literacy and numeracy are more important than anything else in the world, and that if we're doing well in literacy and numeracy, we can assume we're doing well in everything. So it's going to take some effort to convince the public that there's actually more to life than literacy and numeracy, that that as a parent, when my child's in school, that I need to be asking the school how they're doing in terms of creativity. So there's some work that has to be done in selling this to the public. And you're right, because it is important then that we get the policy that promotes it, that supports teachers to support more creativity, that includes room in the room, space, time in the school day for creativity. I'm sorry, I'm reading at the same time. It's an amazing way to, Rena, I feel your pain. I've done them too, where people are chatting at the same time, and it's hard to do both. It's a good it takes a lot of creative skills. So I think that we've talked a lot about the pros and the cons. I'm not sure people have totally explored all the cons. Now, Kelly brings up a problem with the Echo Schools model, which is that schools have to opt into that. So do you end up then with schools that are already creative? Say if we have a creative schools model, you already have a school where creativity is a goal in the school, so they opt in and other schools don't. I think Rena brought up an incredibly important point in terms of the gaps that exist between schools based on socioeconomic status and sometimes based on a variety of issues. And we definitely want to make sure that we don't end up just replicating social gaps in our schools with kind of creativity gaps. Shifting public perception, people agree that, that there are issues in terms of who is creative. Nonconformers are called disruptors, but disruption is totally in right now as the great driver of change. So I think it is worth, when we're thinking about this, linking it to all of the worlds, to not just saying it, just to understanding that it is important that kids get jobs, it's important that kids vote, it's important that they're able to think about, be able to empathize with people outside themselves, that they're contributing members of society, but that we listen to all the various voices. So yes, sometimes we frown on disruptors, but on the other hand, if you look at, we just had a whole meeting, for instance, with a bunch of vice principals from Singapore, where they score the very top in everything. They're the kings and queens of the PISA tests, and they were in a bit of despair about the lack of creativity in their schools, about the fact that they don't create or graduate artists, they don't graduate entrepreneurs, one of the things the head of the group said is, we'll never graduate the inventor of Google, but we'll graduate lots of people who can work at Google. They're good at engineers, but not so good at other things. So I think, it's important to remember that too. So I am finished with the questions, and we are nearly out of time. So we want to keep talking about this, and as we learn more, and as our wonderful domain leads like Rena are thinking about and working on their projects, we want you to stay involved. And before we kind of close this off, Rena, do you have any final words for us?
I'd like to thank the participants for teaching me so much. Thanks, everybody.
That's great, and I think that one of the important things, one of the things that People for Education likes to do is to be able to have our feet and be able to in all camps, and so it's really important to us to bring together researchers like Rena and the rest of us. Chris is applauding. So applause for Rena. Thank you very much, Rena. It's really been wonderful to have you there. And it's great to have these exchanges. There's a tendency for the academic experts to live in their world, and the parents to live in their world, and the teachers in their world. And one of the goals of People for Education is to bring those worlds together. So that's what we're trying to do. So we hope that you stay informed about this project, that you join our email list, that you join us on Facebook. We'll have other webinars in the fall, particularly ones talking about what is a quality learning environment, what does it look like, what are the relationships like between teachers and students. But it's very important that we're all we're building this conversation as much as possible, because as Dan pointed out, part of the goal is to change policy, to change the public's mind, and to change policy. So thanks to all of you. I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, who I think has the final wrap up. So over to you, Jackie, and thanks a lot to everybody who participated.
Wahaha, I got the final wrap-up. I am just going to add to Annie's thanks. I want to thank Rena for her brilliance and her additions to it. It was great to have Dan here too, another expert in the field, and Charles. Thank you to all of our experts who were in there. And the real experts, which are you guys. I think all of the participants, this has been one of our best, I think, webinars on this. You were really engaged participants. Everybody had some great ideas. Wonderful to have our students participating too. So thank you so much for carrying these ideas so much further forward, and I hope to see you in the Measuring What Matters page sharing these ideas further. We will be posting the full webinars, so if your friends are disappointed they didn't get to sit in, they will be able to get it. We just have to give Megan a little bit of time to edit it and get it up there. And we will be sending out helpful links and information as well at the end. So thanks everyone for being here tonight. Let's keep the conversation going and have a great evening.
Bye-bye.